In these next two sessions, we're going to be looking at my book, Leaving the Rapture Behind. Now, this is a book that relates primarily to the end times, but it focuses on the issue that we've been looking at throughout this course, and that is how God in the Old Testament promised the coming of the Messiah and what the Messiah would do, what Jesus would accomplish in His coming to this earth. And it seems to me that we need to spend a little bit of time here. It would be helpful to look at what I would call general Messianic prophecy, more so than personal Messianic prophecy. Remember that distinction between things that directly related to His birth and earthly ministry, His death, His crucifixion and resurrection. Most of the prophecies we looked at in the selected Old Testament text here this course have related to personal Messianic prophecy. And yet we've not made a real careful distinction there, and at times we have looked at others. Any Messianic prophecy that relates to the kingdom, for example, that talks about what's going to happen in the new heavens and the new earth and the new Jerusalem, those would relate to primarily general Messianic prophecy. Based on my book, I have a series of questions that you'll be working through here and preparing along the way. But I thought it might be useful right now just to do a quick summary of the chapters, what each chapter contributes to this study, and that may help you in your reading and seeing what the focus of this book is all about. The name itself suggests that I have some problems with the popular view of the separate rapture of the church. That view basically states that when Jesus came to establish the kingdom, that did not happen because of the rejection of Christ at the hands of that particular generation of Jews, that the kingdom was postponed, and in its place the church age was established. Someday, the theory goes, God will re-establish His plan for Israel. The church will be taken out of the world. That's called the rapture, based on the expression being caught up in 1 Thessalonians 4, that the church will be caught up to be with the Lord in the clouds. And after the church is caught up, taken out of the world, then God is going to begin again working with the nation of Israel. We can expect things like the rebuilding of the temple, ultimately the coming to power of the Antichrist, what some would call the Great Tribulation, and a whole series of events that some people believe the Bible teaches. After that series of events, God will intervene then a second time. This will be the second aspect of the second coming. That might make it a third coming, but I'll let you do the math there. They would distinguish between the revelation, the rapture of the church, and then the revelation, which is some of the glorious appearing language that we read about in the New Testament. And so they view the second coming as a twofold event separated by at least 7. Tim LaHaye has now broadened that sum to maybe as many as 10 or more years between the rapture of the church and the revelation. And this book is basically a refutation of that and trying to show what system this all is based upon and how we should evaluate the system, what I call throughout the book the rapture system. I use that term instead of saying premillennial, pre-tribulational dispensationalism, which rapture system that saved some ink. Well, chapter 1 I entitle, And Then Along Came Earl. This is basically an introduction to my introduction to the issues of prophecy, working with a man in a factory one summer named Earl, and what took place in some of our discussions there. I became more acutely aware of the dispensational theology and some of the assumptions that are made and some of the applications of certain Old Testament and New Testament passages. In that chapter, I refer to what I call the cut and paste method. It seems to me that in order to understand much of what's being said about Bible prophecy, we need to recognize the motivations behind some of the teachings. And I do not have a problem with the overall motivation of the premillennial dispensationalist. They believe that in order to save the Bible from liberalism, infidelity, from rejection, that the literal nature of the Bible must be preserved at all cost. And they would take that literalism to extend throughout prophecy, and especially regarding things concerning Israel. Now, I believe there are times to take the Bible literally and times to take the Bible figuratively. The heart of the debate then is, what are those times, of course, and that's discussed in the book. But it seems to me that this cut and paste method is utilized to save the literal interpretation of the Bible. Now, the problem with that is that when that takes place, and what cut and paste means is you simply take a verse out of the Bible and cut it out and stick it wherever else you want to fit into your system. What happens so often, and Tim LaHaye is guilty of this over and over again in his writings, and I document some of this in the book, that by just cutting verses out of their context, they basically take them out of context and apply them to things that the original passage had nothing to do with. Classic example is the phrase, Day of the Lord. Tim LaHaye seems to be convinced that whenever the phrase Day of the Lord occurs, that refers to the end times after the rapture of the church and relates to the Great Tribulation and the Second Coming. There are many places in the Old Testament where Day of the Lord speaks to some great intervention of God, but has nothing to do with the Second Coming. In the book of Zephaniah, which LaHaye quotes repeatedly as referring to an end times event, in Zephaniah chapter 1, the Day of the Lord clearly relates to, instead, the fall of Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonians in 586 BC. The book of Amos speaks about the day of the Lord, and the day of the Lord will be a day of darkness, it says, not a day of light. The day of the Lord in Amos chapter 5 is not the end times, but rather the invasion of the Assyrians, which is about to come on the scene there in the 8th century BC. The northern kingdom of Israel is going to experience a day of the Lord. God is going to judge them in this decisive way. And so it's a real danger to take certain phrases and words and simply decide what they must mean all the time, and then take certain phrases out of context and just place them wherever it fits into your system. Now, some would call that rightly dividing the word of truth, but in reality, by destroying the context of a passage, you pretty much can do whatever you want with what the Bible teaches. I think the cults do a good job of taking things out of context. You can make a series of statements from the Bible and make them become somewhat ridiculous. And I think sometimes in the dispensational system, the cut and paste method is employed, and I believe it's unjustified, but it's done so in order to, quote, defend a literal interpretation of the Bible. Well, the second chapter is called the Millennial Maze. And in this chapter, and maybe one of the tougher chapters in the book, I work through the various millennial views. You may not know whether or not you are a premillennial, a postmillennial, an amillennial, and you may not at this point care. I've had some people say they were pro-millennial. That means they are all for it, whatever it is. And one teacher stated he was a pan-millennialist one time. He believed it would all pan out in the end. Well, those are kind of cute titles to wear. I've come to the conclusion that if we study Bible prophecy long enough, we are going to find ourselves in some camp, some system of how to deal with these texts and bring them into some type of consistent order. And so I go through the various millennial views. Within premillennialism, I make distinctions between historic premillennialism and what is the most popular view today, and that is the dispensational premillennialism. And a dispensation is just a way that God works with His people at a particular point in time. I would agree there is the Old Testament dispensation and the New Testament dispensation, but dispensationalists have usually a series of 7 or 8 dispensations, and they believe that there is a future dispensation yet to come. It will be the millennial kingdom. We are now in the dispensation of grace, but that will someday change into the kingdom dispensation, which will have a lot of similarities, frankly, to the law dispensation that preceded our own. I asked the question of whether or not Revelation 20, which is a passage that has virtually no parallels in the Old Testament, whether Revelation 20 should be the starting point for our discussion. There we read about Satan being bound for 1,000 years and Christ reigning for 1,000 years. And I discuss what's at stake there and maybe where we should start our discussion, if not Revelation chapter 20. In the third chapter, Israel and the church, there I get into the discussion of the postponement theory. Is the church plan B? Did God intend to bring about the New Testament church as it was realized in the first century? Was that his goal? Or did he have something else in mind that was thwarted because of the rejection of Jesus by the Jews? Has the kingdom been postponed until after the rapture of the church? Of course, then the question is, and I cannot discuss this in my book, I would like to see a good discussion of this as to the exact time frame when the kingdom is allegedly postponed. I have read a lot of studies on this, and I don't see much agreement. If they believe theologically that at some point the kingdom was postponed, the prophetic time clock stopped ticking, that applies to Daniel 9, where they argue that the 70 weeks of Daniel stopped at week 69, and we are still awaiting that final 70th week, which is supposed a 7-year period following the rapture of the church. Exactly how does that fit in? How does that 7-year period fit in? Has the kingdom been postponed, or are we in the kingdom now? That ties in with all the different prophecies we've looked at all semester, dealing with the throne of David and the new covenant, even the conversion of the Gentiles, and the promises that the New Testament quotes from the Old. Are we, as we talked in our last session, are we the new Israel? Is this what God intended to bring about by bringing His Son into the world to be the Savior of the world? Or is this some type of interruption of what God really had in mind? According to Tim LaHaye, there are no prophecies of the church in the Old Testament. That's the consistent claim of the classical dispensational theologians. Chapter 4, Living Under the New Covenant. There I discuss in depth the treatment we did earlier of Jeremiah 31 and the use of Jeremiah 31 in Hebrews chapters 8 and 10. This is a big deal because, again, if there are no prophecies of the church in the Old Testament, then how can the book of Hebrews use Jeremiah 31 when the promise of the new covenant is made to the house of Israel and the house of Judah? So how can you have a prophecy made to the house of Israel and the house of Judah being fulfilled in the New Testament church unless the New Testament church is the new Israel? And so the rapture system has to spend a lot of effort to try to explain away how the book of Hebrews uses Jeremiah 31. And they come up with 2 new covenants or 2 phases of a new covenant, but they recognize the difficulties attached to how the New Testament uses the new covenant promises. Chapter 5 is called No Vacancy on David's Throne. If the kingdom has been postponed, then Jesus is not now sitting on the throne of David, because that was the promised Messianic throne where he would be over the house of Israel. And I just simply go through a whole series of New Testament passages that connect Christ's current reign with the promises to David. Acts chapter 2, Acts chapter 13, Acts chapter 15. We talked about the Council of Jerusalem and Amos 9, 11, and 12 being quoted there in Acts chapter 15, where God would rebuild the tabernacle of David and then the Gentiles would come to know the Lord. That's a throne of David promise. And again, the dispensationalists will have to argue that the usage of Amos 9, 11, and 12 in Acts 15 does not indicate a fulfillment of prophecy, but just an analogy that's presented there. Sort of like saying, well, what's happening now is like what the Old Testament prophesied would happen someday in the future. Again, it's not a very natural understanding of of the way the book of Acts uses Old Testament prophecy. But the throne of David is an important theme of the promises to Israel in the Old Testament. The New Covenant, the throne of David, the conversion of the Gentiles, the reunification of Israel and Judah. We talked about that in connection with Hosea and how that was applied by Paul in Romans 9 to the church, Jew and Gentile brought together, fulfilling the promises that Israel and Judah would someday be reunited. So the throne of David and the New Covenant all are important aspects of this question of the relationship between Israel and the church, and how does the New Testament use Old Testament prophecy. Chapter 6 is entitled, Egypt, My People. Now I take that out of the book of Isaiah. There's a phrase there where it speaks about Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and how they will be united someday with God's inheritance, Israel. And so Assyria, Egypt, Israel, someday worshiping together. Clearly a reference to the New Testament church. In the chapter, Egypt, My People, I show how these promises connected to the throne of David then relate to the conversion of the Gentiles. Isaiah 11, Isaiah 55, Amos 9, as it's quoted in Acts 15. References in Ezekiel 37 to the David, their king, David, their shepherd, and the Gentile inclusion that takes place there. In the book of Ephesians, we look there in chapter 2, how Jew and Gentile brought together one new creation, one new creature. And again, dispensationalism teaches that Old Testament prophecies of the conversion of the Gentiles are not yet being fulfilled. So yes, the Old Testament did prophesy that someday Gentiles would be converted and they would be drawn to Israel. And yes, the New Testament quotes many of those passages, but no, that does not mean that what's happening in the New Testament is the fulfillment of those passages. They would, again, argue for analogy. Just like the Gentiles are coming to the Lord today, so the Old Testament prophesies that in the future yet, the Gentiles will be converted. Well, to me, this is one of the most troubling parts of the dispensational system, and really flies in the face of, I think, common sense as to what God intended and how the New Testament utilizes those passages. I have been invited to teach this book in Egypt by a friend of mine, and I think it was this chapter, or at least the title of this chapter, that caught his attention. I could have called it The Conversion of the Gentiles. Instead, I called it Egypt, My People, based there on Isaiah 19. And I think that chapter title, Egypt, My People, caught his attention. But again, it's one of the ways in which the conversion of the Gentiles is described in the Old Testament. That's one of the tougher chapters in the book. That's some pretty deep reading, looking at how various language is used to describe this Gentile conversion. As we said in this lecture on the church as the new Israel, the idea that Jew and Gentile would be one on equal footing in the New Testament church was not directly revealed in the Old Testament. That's the, quote, mystery that Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 3. Chapter 7 was just a fun chapter called The Times of the Signs. And there I just wrestle with several ideas and aspects that I think have been smuggled into the debate. We are led to believe, for example, that the Bible teaches that the rapture of the church will be like a thief in the night, and that those who are not raptured out of the world will be those who are, quote, left behind. We've all heard that terminology. And we're led to believe that the left behind passages, one is taken and the other is left, series of references there. And the thief in the night passages there in 1 Thessalonians and in 2 Peter, we're led to believe that the thief of the night is the biblical description of the rapture, and that those who are left behind is a biblical description of those who miss out on the rapture. But as you look at the passages that are cited, and I do all this in the chapter here, to me it's rather interesting, if not a bit humorous, that the very language that the rapture hoopla is based upon, left behind and thief in the night, that the dispensationalists themselves, at least the good dispensational scholars, will admit that those phrases are not being exactly used the way the Bible uses them, because in reality, thief in the night is used in contexts that relate to the second coming, or what they would call the revelation of Christ, the glorious appearing, not the rapture. And those passages, for example, in Matthew 25, that relate to the one taken and the other left, those, again, are not rapture contexts. According to the dispensationalists themselves, they are rather revelation or second coming context. So they have taken phrases, left behind and thief in the night, that are applied in the Bible to second coming passages, and they recognize that they are not rapture contexts, and still they apply them to the rapture, at least in their publications and in their titles. They are rather catchy phrases: thief in the night, left behind, even day of the Lord. They will take that and use that in ways that will fit their purposes. So when pressed on the details, they will recognize that these terms are not being used in the biblical way. There are other issues that I relate to there in that particular chapter. I'll let you read through that on your own. But it seems to me that the dispensationalists claim that there are various signs that are to be performed, and they have certain times for these things to come about. And the picture that is presented there gets to be rather confusing. We're going to stop this session now, and when we come back, I'm going to work through the rest of the book with you, relating to some of Jesus' teaching on the end times, Gog and Magog, some of the teaching in the book of Revelation on the new heavens and the new earth, and then finally a look at the issue of the man of lawlessness, and then finally the rapture itself.